Welcome to the Time for Impact podcast and this second instalment of our wide-ranging and insightful chat with Matthew Hick from the Science Museum Group. I hope most of you, if not all of you, had the opportunity to listen to the first episode and are looking forward eagerly to hearing what Matt had to say in the second half of the conversation that we had with him a few weeks ago. So without further ado, here is the second instalment of Matthew Hick on the Time for Impact podcast. Enjoy. Matt, it would be great if you could tell us a bit about the Heritage Volunteering Group, how it started, how it came about, how you got involved.
Nearly 10 years ago that I founded the Heritage Volunteering Group with Danielle Garcia, who's still a volunteer manager at the Imperial War Museum, and Richard Goff, who's now gone on to bigger and better things and is now director of the Soldiers of Shropshire Museum. And we founded the Heritage Volunteering Group because I think, certainly for both myself and Danielle, we'd been working as volunteer coordinators at the time for a long time, 6 or 7 years, and actually it felt like the conversation around volunteering hadn't moved forwards at all. So I was still going to meetings where we were saying, well, why do we need a role description? Should we have a role description? And actually, what I wanted to be having was conversations around strategy and leadership. And to be fair, it feels like the conversation has moved forwards in those 10 years, I would say. So back then, we founded HVG really as a peer-to-peer support network for volunteer engagement professionals within the heritage sector. And the idea was that actually we would help lead the conversation around volunteering within our sector, but we'd also give people the opportunity to connect and learn from one another. And our first strategy that we introduced in 2017 was called Creating Connections. And it was called Creating Connections because actually what we wanted to do was develop volunteering within the sector by creating connections between volunteer coordinators and managers who often would be isolated within their own organisations, creating connections between them and data and professionals from other sectors. And that was very much our focus. We recognised that actually, as a steering group, as we were at the time, none of us had much time and none of us had much money. But actually, if we all gave a little bit, then we could achieve an incredible amount and the very essence of volunteering. 10 years later, we now have nearly 700 members across the globe. We work with organisations from DCMS down to individual museums. We work with academics, and we are just in the process of implementing a new strategy. And that strategy is focused on transforming volunteering across the heritage sector by making sure that heritage organisations are delivering volunteering programmes that transform organisations' lives and communities. And we, as I say, we are a membership organisation. We run national conferences. We run several social media channels which have had content viewed 250,000 times over the last year. We produce regular newsletters. We've got a YouTube channel with lots of content out there to help support and further the conversation around volunteering and supporting people to become the best they can be, become better leaders. But equally, part of the big shift for us as an organisation over the next few years is moving away from solely focusing on our members to actually advocating more effectively for volunteering across the heritage sector and working more at an organisational level to enhance director and senior leadership teams' understanding of the impact that volunteering can have. So we're doing much more work for our volunteer coordinators, our managers, everybody that's a member within HVG, so that we can make their work on a day-to-day basis much simpler and ultimately deliver on our vision for volunteering.
It seems like there's something really interesting for me there, Matt. The kind of like communities we build in our jobs, right? Like a lot of what we're doing is about trying to like bring together people and activate sort of latent talent and skills and interest and, to do good for communities. And like, it feels like there's real power there in going, well, why can't we do that for the sector as a whole? If we come together sector-wise, we can be powerful as well, and kind of be the change we want to see. I think there's something really powerful about that. And a top tip from me, I suppose I'd say as well, is like, if anyone's listening to this, like, get in a network, like join a network. If you're someone who kind of leads volunteers, like anything you can do to, there's loads of great opportunities out there to sort of link with other professionals, even if it's just connecting with people in LinkedIn and trying to have a coffee, or joining the Heritage Volunteer Group, or other volunteer networks are available. It's so great for professional development, for sharing ideas. For every sort of day I've ever been to in that, I usually leave or every conversation I usually leave refreshed and inspired. So yeah, top tip for anyone out there listening: get in a network, meet with your peers, share ideas. It's how we change the world, I think.
Matt, you're known as a bit of well, we haven't mentioned your YouTube channel. Maybe you will, but you're known as a bit of a. I'm going to call you a guru. You might disagree, but you spend a lot of time reading and thinking deeply about management, about leadership, and one of the things I love about the kind of things that you put out there is you're not just. I mean, Matt's talking about talking to your colleagues across the sectors and other volunteer professionals, and I encourage that. But actually, a lot of your thinking actually is kind of tangential when it comes from other sectors. And I know you like to read your business books and to see what the sector can learn from the world of management in terms of staff and the world of business, and sort of intellectual thinking in right across organisation. I wonder if you got any gems or reflections for us in terms of how we can make sure there's that flow of learning between heritage and charity, between charity and business, etc.
Yeah, well, someone far smarter than me once said, "Leaders are readers," and I think that is so true. And that that doesn't mean you have to be reading loads of books. I subscribe to Harvard Business Review, which is amazing, and I'd really recommend that as well. But what fires me up is reading kind of business and leadership books and thinking about how what they talk about and what they speak to applies to our work with volunteers. So looking at those books through the lens of volunteerism. And this is a program about innovation and about being innovative. That's where innovation comes from. Read about the IT sectors, read about successful business, read about leadership change programs, and apply that to the work that you're doing. I mean, I've just read a great book by someone called Beth Comstock, who's a former director at GE, and that's called Imagine It Forwards. And that is a book about being innovative. It's a book about leading change. And, I suppose people might be listening to this podcast and be thinking, well, it's all right. You kind of run a volunteer program at a big organization, and, you've got lots of resource, and that's all well and good. But I'm a volunteer coordinator at a small organization with no time and no money. I'm never going to get there. Well, what Beth talks about is this idea of innovation being an iterative process. And I would completely echo that. When I started as volunteer coordinator at the NRM, that was on a 6-month contract, because we were going to get rid of my post and have one volunteer manager for the entire group based in London. 10 years later, because of the work that I'd done at the National Railway Museum, and later that my amazing colleagues had done as volunteer managers across Science Museum Group, we've raised the profile of volunteering. We've built that culture of volunteerism. We've now got a whole team of volunteer managers that are supporting a huge program. And as a group, we've gone from an organisation that had maybe 20 or 30,000 volunteer hours a year to just before COVID, where we had over 100,000 hours of volunteer involvement. And that didn't happen because of one gigantic step, and it's very rare that we go from candle to light bulb moments. Innovation is an iterative process. It takes a long time. It takes lots of small steps. It takes passion. It takes commitment, and it takes leadership. And I think that's one of the things that we're really interested in at HVG, is the idea of growing the leadership skill set, the leadership mindset within volunteer managers, so that actually not only do you feel confident to lead change, you feel capable to lead and deliver change as well, because the reality is that change in volunteering won't happen without us. And that's why I read what I read, because I want to grow and develop and transform volunteering across Science Museum Group.
I think that point on change is really interesting. I remember sort of that incremental change is sometimes almost the kind of change you don't really notice until you sit back and look where you were and where you've got to, right? I remember sort of early in my career at a kind of charity AGM, a CEO sort of standing up and sort of saying, effectively like, someone told me we don't do change at this organization, and then proceeded to put up a load of slides about all the things that had changed in the last, the last 2 to 3 years that they hadn't been doing before. And I think there's a real sort of skill in that, in terms of like people, the organization had moved a huge amount, but people had absorbed it and it had been successful, and, people had felt that it was part of the piece. And I think at various points in my career, I felt like in the middle of sort of complex change programs going, I don't know how on earth we're going to do this. And then you look back a few years down the line and you go, and it's just kind of part of everyone's moved on and you're on to the next big thing. I think that kind of change piece is really interesting. And I think finding that space for change and innovation is also really important too. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Matt. That's something I certainly grapple with.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of points I'd like to speak to, I suppose, on that particular one. So it's interesting. A colleague of mine said to me, we were talking about kind of leadership today, actually, and she said, well, actually, it's okay for you, Matt, because you're in that position and you've got the time and the capacity to develop and lead change. But that wasn't always the case. When I was the volunteer coordinator at NRM, nobody was interested in having a volunteering strategy and a plan or anything. But I didn't have the time to do it. So I recruited 4 or 5 volunteers who basically did almost everything for me. They did. They supported with recruitment. They supported with welcome and induction. They supported with health and safety. They supported with our events program. They supported with writing our volunteer newsletters. And what that meant was that I was then able to sit down and develop a volunteering strategy and to put in place kind of proper work plans for us as a team, for our volunteers, and to work to transforming the culture of volunteering across the organisation. They were an amazing team, and several of them support me now as head of volunteering. And I couldn't have achieved what I did without them. And I think that's something else that's important to say, actually. Is change is never down to a single individual. What we've done at Science Museum Group has been down to some amazing volunteers, some amazing volunteer managers, to amazing supervisors. All I've done is set the direction of travel. Leadership is about being collaborative. And actually, if you want to build a culture of volunteering, you need to collaborate. You need to enable people to be the best that they can be. You need to set a direction of travel, and you need to provide a framework for delivering that vision, but you need to allow people the space to deliver it. Now, if we had some of our volunteer managers on this podcast, they would probably say to you what they say to me, which is, Matt, I'm really stretched and you're asking me to do all of this and to go out and engage community partners and to go and write these reports and share them with senior leadership teams. I'm just trying to run a program. I'm just trying to get by in day to day. And that absolutely is a challenge. And that's a challenge for our teams. And I think that's where it's important to be collaborative. It's important to be flexible. It's important to push, but not push too hard. And this is why I read and listen a lot to leadership podcasts and read leadership books, actually, because I want to become a more effective leader, and that means having the emotional intelligence to actually say, do you know what, if somebody's like doing 101 day-to-day things just to keep the program afloat, what they don't need is me on their back saying, yeah, but what about the strategic stuff? You really need to deliver that. As long as you set that direction of travel and provide the culture and the framework for it to be delivered, you will get there. Give people the time to come on that journey with you. And to speak to the first point, I think that's important, because actually, when I started as head of volunteering, all of our sites function completely independently. And so I was appointed and I said, Matt, you've got no staff and no budget. Go and transform volunteering across Science Museum Group. And it was really, really hard. I had people that were managing our managers who should have been my key stakeholders saying, I'm not bothered what you're doing in York, Matt. This is a different museum. We do what we want, essentially. And so that was really, really hard. And I guess kind of what I learned through that process was actually to make change happen around people like that. And actually, eventually, they get swept along in the tide, but it wasn't easy. And I definitely came close to jacking things in during that time. But I had a really great boss, and she, one of the things she did when I was really stressed, was sort of, she sat down with me and she drew this circle, and then she drew a slice out of it, and then she scribbled the rest of the circle out. And she said, all you can influence is this little section. Focus on that, and I'll be happy, and see what happens. And from that point on, we transformed volunteering across the organisation. And it was one of those Yoda moments. Probably wouldn't want me to refer to her as Yoda, but it was really powerful. And, that talk about that as, later come to learn, that's what we call the nexus of influence, isn't it? Actually, where can we exert our influence as leaders most effectively, and focus on that, and don't worry about and don't get stressed about what's going on out of your control.
All those little incremental changes we talked about, they're making things better. And whilst we want to achieve the big change, sometimes those little incremental things are important, and we should celebrate them. And finding the time to do that is really key.
Absolutely. And that's why it's good to make those changes incrementally, because like you've said, it's difficult. And like I've said, it's difficult for our volunteer managers to find the time and the space. So actually, we talk a lot, don't we, as leaders, about making quick wins, easy wins, those little iterative changes that we can make. So to give you a really practical example, our teams are flat out at the moment. One of the little changes that we can make to make volunteering more effective is to rewrite our role description. So a few years ago, because we wanted volunteering and volunteers to be as much part of the organisation as employees, we had very, very similar what we call vacancy information packs for staff and for volunteers. It was obvious there were different employment opportunities in inverted commas, but actually it was really long. It created lots of barriers. So actually, we've put in a couple of meetings, we've transformed that activity, that role description, and we're now thinking about it very, very differently. And that's a really small, quick win that we can make that's going to help us to move away from something that potentially presented barriers to people getting involved to something which is far more, is going to deliver the outcomes we want. And I think part of what we've done there to move on to maybe another subject is to talking about innovation, is actually to think about things like role descriptions instead of just basically a description of the job, to think of it as a marketing tool. And so to think of ourselves when we're going into the recruitment space as marketeers. So how do we schedule the flow of information to new recruits? So we don't need a 5-page document that tells them every single thing about the job, every single thing about the organisation, all of the training that they're going to be provided, the strategic plan of the organisation. What we need is something short and sweet, the purpose of which is to get people to fill in an application form. And then and there might be a little bit more information on the application form, and then we can give them more information at interview or selection day, and more information at the welcome and induction day, so that we're scheduling that flow of information so it's as seamless and easy as possible for people to get involved. So to give you a really good example of a couple of things that we've done when we've been reviewing the role description, is we've removed all of the stuff about Science Museum Group's vision and values, because as important as that is to us as an organisation, it isn't important to people potentially applying for us. Now, what I would say, and I'll come back to this, is the need to tailor the content to the audience that we're targeting. But generally speaking, we've moved away. We used to have a huge section on it. We now talk specifically about Science Museum Group is here to help inspire futures and to transform local communities, let's say. Blah, blah, blah. Here's a short 3-line introduction about the role. So we've cut that down massively. We've removed the stuff about, for example, needing a visa to over 18 in certain roles, because that's then, you can access that information on the application form. So again, it's removing that barrier, something that might put people off. So let's keep them engaged until at least they fill out the application form. So that's a couple of things that we've done. I guess the other thing that we're looking at is actually, and it's going back to the other point, is talking about kind of tailoring that content to the audience that we're trying to recruit. And this comes back to thinking like a marketeer, right? So actually, the way that you write for one audience, for an older audience, is going to be very different, or should be very different, to a role that you're targeting at a younger audience. Maybe the role title is going to be different if you're thinking about it for a younger audience. Does everything need to be XYZ volunteer, or can it be something a bit more creative and something more appealing to the audience that you're trying to attract? And one of the ways that I'm trying to encourage the team to do this is to start using AI to help write role descriptions, help write some of the copy, so that actually so within our activity outlines, we'll have a description of the role. So we can take that, we can put that in ChatGPT and say, write this for an audience that's 18 to 21 in 200 characters. And then we can put that, and that not only helps us kind of write more engaging content, it speeds up the work because we're not having to sit down and think about rewriting what's in the activity outline, and it writes it in a way that's going to appeal to our audience. Once we've got that written, we can then say, based on this, give me a title for this role that's going to appeal to a group of millennials. And all of a sudden, we've tailored that content that our supervisors are giving to the audience that we want to recruit. And then we might have a nice image on it. And actually, for our older traditional volunteers, they might want a picture of a Elmira flask, or they might want a picture of a locomotive. For a younger audience, they might want to see somebody their age who represents them interacting with visitors. So again, thinking about the imagery that we use, all of this matters. When if we think like a marketeer, then surely that's better than just popping out a standard role description.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I mean, so many great ideas, and we wanted innovation, and we're getting it by a bucket load here, aren't we? So, you're really helping out. I'm just to take us back a step. I'm kind of interested to look at this from how we evolved, and next generation of volunteering leaders. You and I and Matt have all been around a while now. We've got a way to go yet, but we've been around a while. But we want new people to come up, new blood to come through, and to move into those spaces. And I suppose, all the stuff you're talking to me about, or talking to us about around management, is music to my ears, because I come from a background of academia teaching management, so it's lovely to me. And that wasn't volunteering management; that was business management. So I came along that path, and I know your background, because I had a look at your LinkedIn profile, is in archaeology, but you've self-taught yourself around all this kind of stuff. But I'm interested in your views on what future volunteering professionals should either come with or should equip themselves with in terms of those skills. So as you've been talking, you've talked about marketing, you've touched on project management to a degree, you've certainly talked a lot about human behavior, and you've talked about some of those kind of leadership and visioning sort of skills. I wonder your views in terms of what would make the rounded volunteering professional even richer beyond understanding volunteering, because those things aren't uniquely about volunteering, are they? They're wider skills.
I would say two things. Come with a willingness to learn and an openness and an interest in everything. Because surely one of the great joys of this job and this profession is the breadth of work that you can be involved with. I mean, over the years, I've done everything from events management to marketing to strategic development to administration. Today, I've just built a digital dashboard using the Looker Studio. So I've even done some ICT work and plugged in all my data reports into a live dashboard. So, that is the great joy of the job, and you can craft the job to meet your interests. So for me, and certainly what I look for when I'm appointing volunteer managers is someone who's hungry, humble, and smart, and and that willingness to learn, because I love this job, and the reason that I love it is because I get to do so much, so many different things, and that's what I would be saying. Now, that's probably not the answer that you wanted, Chris.
No, I'd agree. I'd say be curious and say yes to everything.
Absolutely. Do you know what? So one of the volunteers that I work with, who is an absolute inspiration and is amazing, and he was, well, I won't get into what he did, but he asked me a few years ago to read his biography that he'd written himself. and it was, it was about his entire life. And the one thing that stands out in that is every time somebody asked him to do that, to do something, he took that opportunity and he took it with a smile and he delivered that. In his profession, he rose up the ranks from being right at the very bottom to right at the very top, because every time somebody presented him with something, whether it was a challenge or not, he accepted that challenge. Not only did he accept it, but he accepted it with a smile. And I learned something every day from that guy. He's become a good friend, and he's an absolute inspiration. And I would say that to anybody: take every opportunity that it comes along. It's not always comfortable, it's not always easy, but it is incredibly rewarding. I mean, I had to do so. So a few months ago. So after doing a presentation to our executive, I'd been asked to basically pull together a film for our trustee away day. So I'd created a video for it, and we showed it. I wasn't going to do anything else, but I got chatting to one of the trustees, who then kindly said to our deputy director, "Oh, this guy's great. I think you should ask him to do 15 minutes." And so then the director said to me, "Matt, do you want to do 15 minutes off the cuff on volunteering for all of our trustees and executive?" And it would, they're an incredibly supportive executive, and it would have been very easy for me to say, no, actually, I don't feel very comfortable with that. But actually, I was prepared to step out of my comfort zone, do that, and it went down really well. And because of that, it's helped really grow the interest in volunteering. So, that's something that, working with that volunteer, that's that sort of inspiration. Actually not to say no in those situations, but to say yes and see where it takes you.
Marvelous. Well, Matt, thanks ever so much for joining us. There's so many nuggets of inspiration in there that I think, well, even I'm going to listen back several times. And I've got the pleasure of editing it, so I'll probably hear it lots of times anyway. But I'm sure our listeners will want to reflect over and over again on what you said. If people want to get in touch with you, Matt, how would they do that?
So they can get in touch at heritagevolunteeringgroup@gmail.com or matthew.hick@sciencemuseum.ac.uk.
And if they want to hear about the Heritage Volunteering Group?
Yeah, we're on the internet, isn't everybody? At www.heritagevolunteeringgroup.com. Lots of social media channels. We're at Heritage Vols on Twitter. Still not calling it X. We're on Facebook. You can find us on there. You can find us on YouTube. If you look anywhere, you'll find us.
Fantastic. Well, thanks ever so much for your time, and thanks for everything you do for volunteering as a profession and for the sector as well. I know it's a bit of a labour of love, but I'm sure it's appreciated by your colleagues. Certainly is here.
Well, we do it because we love it, don't we? It's such a great profession to be involved in.
Wonderful. Thanks, Matt. Well, that's the end of our two-parter with Matt Hick, and so much to think about over 2 podcasts. Where do we start? This idea about volunteering meeting local needs, this idea that, that's really important. And if we can really get volunteering to meet local needs, everyone wins.
I thought that was fascinating, Matt. The way, I mean, it's something we all talk about a lot, at least I certainly do. But you come across very few people who really bring that to life in the way that Matt has at the Science Museum Group, really tying his work into the social fabric of the community in which the museum exists, and demonstrating that in such a strategic and thoughtful way. I thought that was fantastic.
It feels the antidote to me to sometimes this conversation that I'm sure many of our listeners will have come up against sometimes, which is effectively, are volunteers just free labour? Should we be paying someone to do this, etc., etc.? And it really gets into the depths of no, volunteering is really intrinsically valuable. And I guess it's our job as a sector, as people who be volunteers, to ensure that value is really designed and baked into the opportunities that we're creating for people. I think that's so important.
Yeah, I
The other
often
thing I thought was really key in that area that Matt was emphasizing was the real importance of working in partnership with local councils, partnership with local organizations to really sort of unlock the potential in local communities. Again, so organizations win, so individuals win, so communities win. And I think that's something quite kind of revelatory for me. You know, sometimes it can feel quite a lonely business when we're starting to think about how we attract and bring people into the organization. And like, you know, where do we start with this kind of stuff? This idea of working in partnership, again, really feels like it could be about unlocking that. We're not on our own. There's other people that are looking for exactly the kind of opportunities that our organization is really trying to fill. And there's an opportunity there for, you know, for matching the right skills that are in communities, you know, with that value of volunteering to make a real difference.
and he clearly lives that, you know, through the Heritage Volunteering Group and beyond. And I liked his quote that the leadership is about collaboration as well, which kind of really buys into that. It's not about having your view and forging that direction. It's about working with others to do that. And I thought that was lovely.
Yeah, and sometimes that's about getting out of the way, right? Like
Yeah.
sometimes, you know, that's set the direction, get out of the way, and let that talent, let those skills do what they're going to do. And yeah, I
And
think
some of the
that's
way
so.
he's got his volunteers really making a really strategic contribution to scoping the work that they do is amazing. His trust in his volunteers is evident.
Yeah. So another big thing for me that I'm really excited about, and I think I'm gonna talk about this in other areas, is I guess the language of impact, which I thought was really interesting. You know, you've got to be able to speak different languages about impact to different people, and sometimes that's, you know, sometimes that's the more boring stuff, and sometimes that's, you know, the hours, the numbers and stuff. Well, that's boring to me. I'm sure other people get excited by that. But sometimes it's about, you know, the softer impacts, the stuff that's harder to measure. That's certainly something I'm going to take with me. That's
Yeah.
really important to think
And
about. What language are we using?
it's a question I get asked all the time. Almost every meeting I have, and certainly every conference I go to, somebody in a breakout somewhere will ask about how do we demonstrate the impact of volunteering, usually to CEOs or to boards, but sometimes to others. And you know, without, well, a bit of a selfish plug for Time for Impact, but one of the things we do is we work impact assessments using balanced scorecards, so they can do exactly that. So they can talk about impact in a language, in a format that is understandable and has a cultural resonance with CEOs or with funders and so on. And I think that's so important. I know some volunteer leaders find it quite frustrating that they have to do that. But the truth is, that's the world we live in. You do have to demonstrate the impact of what you do in a language that others can understand.
Absolutely. Now, Chris, next one. Leaders are readers. Are you a reader?
Am I a reader? I'm not always the right things. I read anything and everything, but I'm constantly reading. And I've done that all my life. But I so agree. And do you know, it doesn't matter what you read. There's always some tangential takeaway through reading for me. There's always something you can say, what does that mean in my job, in my life, or my way of thinking? By reading, you hear different perspectives, and those perspectives change your opinions and your influences and the way you go about things. So yeah, I completely buy into that.
Shout out here to Matt's YouTube channel. If you don't follow it or you haven't ever seen it before, would really recommend it. In some respects, Matt's doing the reading, so you don't have to, right? But it's a great sort of short summaries of interesting things he's been reading. So if you're inspired, yeah, that's a great thing to check out. I'd really recommend it. It's certainly been really useful for me in some of the things I've been thinking about. I thought the reflections on change were also really interesting, and certainly something, you know, in my world, this kind of how do we change the tide, how do you turn that kind of oil tanker around, sort of metaphorically, that can feel quite difficult and quite draining. And you know, particularly sometimes, you know, people can be challenges in that. And I really like this idea of, you know, making change happen around people and they get carried away by the tide, I think is really interesting and helps us all kind of stick with it sometimes. And I also really love the part about kind of just really being in control of the things we can influence and focusing on that. That's something I've often had to remind myself about, what are the things we can influence, and let's really sort of worry about and focus on those things and not the things we can't control sometimes.
Yeah, and when we were talking beforehand, and it came out a bit in the podcast, he talked quite a bit to us about iterative change as opposed to big transformation, and I think that's really insightful as well. Just recognizing, actually, even the language. When we talk about transformation, to some people that's quite threatening and quite scary kind of thinking. But actually, transformation doesn't have to be an enormous, great project. Sometimes it can be being clear about where you're trying to get to and moving the tanker forward inch by inch. And I thought that was a really nice way of looking at it.
And sometimes, like, once you've done that, I guess, like, people worry what all the fuss was about. That, they feel like that change either hasn't happened or it was, I've witnessed some instances where people, where something is quite dramatically changed and people denying that anything was ever different in the first place, which I always think is quite interesting and
It's always
really
been like that.
interesting aspects of change. And then I guess finally for me, one of the things that was really interesting was just like thinking so differently about role design and people planning and what tools are available in our toolbox now to change to change how we market roles, thinking like a marketeer, like how can we challenge ourselves to do more of that
Yeah.
is just exciting to me. I want to get there and start to use AI to make my role description speak new language, or appear in new languages.
And
Fantastic.
volunteer recruitment there's no getting away from it. Volunteer recruitment is a marketing exercise. It's not like applying, trying to find new recruits for jobs. Who you kind of advertise what you want and hope you find somebody who's got the right skills. Volunteering recruitment is much more about saying, what are you looking for as a volunteer? What's your aspirations? What's your experiences? And then it's reaching out to different markets and different groups and different individuals in different ways that suit their aspirations and their desires. We often say we're competing with Netflix and Coronation Street and dating and watching football or whatever it might be, as well as volunteering for other charities. So I think that marketing mindset and for me, an understanding amongst volunteering professionals of the basics of marketing is really, really important. You can't get away from it.
The last thing, Chris, I'd like to draw attention to, which again, I'm certainly going to take something away from, and certainly I think it struck a bit of a chord with me because I think lots of us in the sort of volunteer leadership profession will know volunteers and people who we've made a connection with along the way, who we've really gelled with, who we've really learnt from. And I think for me, that kind of one of the things that seemed to really come across from Matt to me is like make connections with the people we're supporting. What can we learn from them as well as what they can learn from us? I think that is so vital. And, one of the things Matt's clearly drew on was this whole kind of idea of take challenges with a smile. So two things from me, I suppose, to finish, which I'm certainly going to take away is, the importance of those connections of the people we work with and we lead. That's absolutely vital. It's certainly one of the things that keeps me in this area and keeps me excited to do the things I do, and taking the challenges we face with a smile. I think that's something we should all be doing more of.
What a lovely note to end on. So if you've got ideas for future guests for the podcast, we're really keen to hear from innovators, creators, anybody who's trying to push the boundaries of volunteering as a profession. We really want to have them on this podcast. So do put them in touch with us, recommend them to us, whether they're from big charities or small charities, cultural organizations or sector organizations, famous people or people may not have heard of before. We really want to hear from them. So if you want to get in touch with us with those suggestions or indeed any other ideas or feedback, our email address is podcast@timeforimpact.co.uk. and we'd really love to hear from you. If you've liked what you've heard, please subscribe and listen to more. We will keep sending these out as long as people keep listening. We'll keep having the conversations. Please share with your friends and your colleagues and your family or anyone else who may be interested, and spread the word as wide as you can, so we can spread the word across the profession. So thanks for listening, and we hope you will tune in for future episodes. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.